It's wonderful to see everybody this evening. Before I begin, I would just like to give a little plug for the Pardes Learning Seminar, which is going to be at the end of December, December 27th to December 31st. For the past 15 years, I was the educational director of the Pardes Learning Seminar. Essentially, it is a week of intensive learning surrounding a particular topic. The topic, which is going to be next month, is Who Am I? The Complexity of Identity in the 21st Century. This seminar was actually held at the end of June, this past June, July, on Zoom. We adapted it specifically for Zoom. And we had, and I see a number of people here who are participants. We had 40 participants, and I would say overall the response was very, very positive to the seminar. After the shiur, I will be allowing for 5 to 10 minutes of questions, comments on the shiur, and then subsequently there will be Rabbanit Nechama Goldman Barish, who is now going to be my replacement in running the seminar, and Amira Mintz Morgenthau, who will be handling the logistics, and they will be available for questions and answers to give you more information about the seminar after the shiur. So I encourage people to stick around, ask questions. And in fact, there are a number of people here who, if they decide to stay around, who are past participants, I think will be able to encourage you to actually sign up for the seminar, which is will be a very rewarding experience. So without any further ado, what I'd like to do is to now go to our parsha. I think that, the source sheet I see already. There is a source sheet that's connected with the shiur this week. And the topic is the personality of Isaac. Who was Isaac? And I apologize in advance to people who have heard my podcasts, because I will be definitely overlapping on things that I've said. But I think that there will also be a number of new angles that I'll be presenting. And let me begin by saying that generally when people talk about our parsha, the thing which people usually focus on is the sibling rivalry between Yaakov and Esav, and especially the story about how Yaakov, quote unquote, steals the blessings from Esav. But in fact, the essential topic of our parsha is actually how it begins. Untitled Toldot Yitzchak. This is the life story of Yitzchak. And that's exactly what I want to talk about. And I have a particular interest in doing this because I feel that of all the patriarchs, Yitzchak is the one who tends to get short shrifted. Usually people are very excited about Avraham, like he's, as I would say, a trailblazer, right? An iconoclast, a revolutionary. And then Jacob is somebody that people can really empathize with because he's so human with all the struggles that he goes through. But Isaac seems to be somebody that people have a hard time connecting to. And I'll even put it out on the table right now that one of the things which I think probably bothers a lot of people is that Isaac just seems to be, right, to use the Yiddish expression, a nebuch. It's like he's kind of the victim of circumstance. Okay, he seems to be very, very passive. So what I'd like to do tonight is to be able to show you perhaps a different perspective on Isaac. And to a certain extent, I would actually like to connect what I'm going to say tonight with what I spoke about last week in terms of Sarai, Isaac's mother. So let us begin with what I have on my source sheet. And if for whatever reason somebody's not using the source sheet, that's fine. I'll tell you what chapter and verse we're looking at. Okay, but you have the source sheet on the side of the page in the chat. Okay, we'll start actually. I want to start with two glimpses of Isaac, which are before this parsha. The first one is in the Akedah. Okay, and if you look at Breshit, chapter 22, these are verses 6 to 8. Okay, and we're not going to go into a whole discussion about the Akedah. I'm only interested in looking at it right now from the angle of what do I see about Isaac in the story. And so what we're told is Avraham took the wood and the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son. And this is when he's about to go to Mount Moriah, to Har Moriah. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. And here the phrase which is actually important is they both went together. Vayalchu shnehem yachdav. And then all of a sudden I have in two verses, in the next two verses, a short conversation between the two of them. And by the way, just so that you understand this, okay, from the time God said to Avraham, Lech Lecha, to go to the Akedah, until he actually did what he needed to do, 3 days elapsed. And I would imagine that over the course of 3 days, they had stuff to talk about, yet the Torah doesn't tell me anything, and rarely does it tell me about various conversations. But here the Torah felt a need to tell me about this conversation. And Isaac, so let's look at Pasuk Zayin 7. Isaac spoke to Avraham, his father, and said, "My father." And Avraham responded, "Here I am," or for those of you who are familiar with the Hebrew, Hineni b'ni. Here I am, my son. And then Isaac says, "Here is the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham said, "God will provide himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." By the way, when I read the Torah, so I tend to emphasize when Isaac says, "My father," and Avraham says, "My son," and then he says a second time, "My son." And then at the end it says, "And so they both went together." Now, what do I see about Isaac from this conversation? Well, first of all, it's not clear how old he was at the time of the Akedah, and I'm not going to get into that discussion. But what does matter to me is that he's asking his father a very straightforward question, and a question which, in a certain sense, okay, is begged. It's as if you have to ask that question given the circumstances. If you look at what happened in the Akedah, Avraham has everything, okay, in order to bring a burnt offering to God. He's made all the necessary preparations. He has a knife, he has fire, he has wood. And yet, the most important thing, the sacrifice, the lamb, where is the lamb? And Isaac asks that question. And not only that, but the way it begins is, "My father." And then Abraham says, "My son," and a second time, "My son." And what I would want to argue over here, which I think is pretty much the pshat, is that Isaac is very much aware, or certainly has the sense that perhaps he will be the offering. And when he says, "My father," and Avraham responds, "My son," there is the sense that this whole father-son relationship is now being called into question. As if Isaac is saying, "My father, are you about to do to me what I think you're about to do?" And Avraham's response is, "I know you're my son. And whatever will be, you will always be my son." And the beginning of the conversation and the end of the conversation says, and they both went together. And Rashi brings the rabbinic comment which says, the first time around. If you look at Rashi subsequently, he says, Abraham, who was aware that he was going to slay his son, walked along with the same willingness and joy as Isaac, who had no idea of the matter. And then if you look a few lines down at the end, when it says the second time, they both went together with the same ready heart. Which therefore means, and this is the rabbinic understanding, and I think this is actually the pshat, because this is why this conversation is recorded, that it wants to show us the sense of unity between Avraham and Yitzchak. Avraham, initially, when he knows what God is asking him to do, goes with the same enthusiasm. Enthusiasm is Isaac, who initially doesn't know what's happening, but is being told, right, we are now going to serve God. And it's interesting that the rabbis use the language, he goes with joy, with excitement. And yet all of a sudden it dawns on Isaac, maybe he will be the burnt offering. And yet despite the fact that Avraham doesn't deny it, and maybe even hints that that may in fact be the case, Isaac willingly accompanies Avraham. And if you were to look at subsequent midrashim, Isaac not only willingly goes along with him, but is an active partner in bringing about the akedah, the binding, because according to the midrash, it was Isaac's idea to do the binding so that at the moment of truth, he would not flinch and disqualify the sacrifice. So what am I trying to bring out with this? That at least according to the rabbinic understanding, what you have is Isaac, who is not some simple-minded child who's simply going along with his father, but a child that's very perceptive, a child who's very much aware. And not only is he aware, but he's even willing to ask the question, the hard question of his father. And when his father gives him a response, which is somewhat ambiguous, and we might even say is gently implying that yes, he will be the sacrifice, that in fact Isaac not only accepts it, but becomes an active partner to Avraham in bringing this about. So that already what the rabbis see in this conversation which is happening over here, and then develop even further in the story of the Akedah, is how that Isaac is not at all a passive accomplice, but is very much an active partner and participant in what's happening. And by the way, I would maybe add to that, that might also be the reason why in our prayers, when we refer to this incident, we don't refer to it as the test of Abraham, which is how chapter 22 begins, but we refer to it as the binding of Isaac and somehow connected with what Isaac did. So that's the first glimpse we have of Isaac. Now let's look at the second. By the way, I'm not finished. I'm going to come back to something in the Akedah story, but I want to wait till the next thing. The next thing is last week's Parsha. And last week's Parsha, we spoke about the death of Sarai, but chapter 24 is very much involved with the mission of finding a wife for Isaac. And as we see from the story, Isaac does not go and find a wife for himself, but Avraham sends his servant to find a wife. And as we know from the story, we're not going to go into it, he succeeds in finding the right person, brings her back. And again, one could say in this whole story, here is Isaac, who in effect has his life shaped by other people, by his father, by the servant who ultimately is the one who decides who the appropriate person is going to be. But it's not exactly the case. If you look at last week's Parsha, chapter 24, verse 65, and I purposely started with 65. When Rebecca is accompanying the servant, all of a sudden she sees this man out in the field. And we're going to come back to this verse because it says that Isaac went out in the field, lasuach basadeh. Okay, I'm going to leave now for the moment the translation. And when she sees this man, she says, "Who is this man who is walking?" And the servant says, "He is my master." She took her veil, she covered herself. And then the servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. And then we get to Pasuk 67. And Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent and took Rebekah, and she became his wife. He loved her. Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. And I know that there are a lot of people who start going into all kinds of Freudian analysis about marrying the woman who resembles your mother, and what does that say about you? I'm not going to go there. What interests me in the story are two things. The first thing, despite the fact that the servant was sent on a mission to find a wife for Isaac, Isaac doesn't receive her and then say, "Of course, this is the woman that I'm going to marry." But Isaac feels a need to somehow determine for himself if she is the appropriate person for him to marry. And the litmus test is to bring her into the tent of his mother and to somehow on that basis see, does he really want to in the end marry her or not? So already, even if I don't take any midrashim, I simply go by the text. It's not enough for Isaac to just be handed this woman and then say, "Well, of course, she's the one I'm going to marry." And no, he has to determine for himself. And what I brought you over here is Rashi's comment, which is again a midrash, that says, why did he bring her to Sarah's tent? And the midrash says something which I'm sure many people here are familiar with. He brought her into the tent and she became exactly like his mother Sarah. That is to say, while Sarah, I'm skipping two lines, while Sarah was alive, a light had been burning in the tent from one Sabbath eve to the next. There was always a blessing in the dough, and a cloud was always hanging over the tent. But since her death, all these had stopped. However, when Rebecca came, they reappeared. So I want to just make one comment over here because it relates to what I discussed last week. I had wanted to discuss this midrash last week in talking about Sarah. For those of you who were with me last week, okay, I think that what I tried to show you at the very end from the Al-Sheikh, from his commentary, a Kabbalistic commentary, was that Sarah and Avraham were in a certain sense the tikkun, the corrective for Adam and Eve. And the point that I made at the end, and not I made, the Al-Sheikh makes, is that if Adam and Eve, by eating of the tree of knowledge, brought death into the world, Avraham and Sarah brought life into the world. And in fact, the Al-Sheikh goes on to quote this midrash. And if you look at the three things that are mentioned here, they all relate to the story of Adam and Eve, right, in the aftermath of the Garden of Eden. What happened? Well, in the aftermath of that story, God curses the land. Thorns and thistles will grow. By the sweat of your brow, you will eat bread. But in the tent of Sarai, there is a blessing in the dough, which means that if the land was cursed, okay, if you might say on some level, the harmony between people and nature was disturbed, in the tent of Sarai, she's trying to reclaim that original harmony, to bring back a certain blessing. And remember, the dough in particular, the dough is is the instrument for making bread. So rather than saying by the sweat of your brow you will eat bread, okay, what it's saying over here is there will be a blessing in that dough. That in fact, bread will not be an expression of a curse, but will actually be a blessing. By eating of the tree of knowledge, they brought death into the world. They become mortal. A candle is a symbol of life. Kiner Hashem nishmat adam. The soul of a person is compared to a candle. Right? When did Adam and Eve sin according to the Midrash? They sinned on Erev Shabbat, on Friday, the very day they were created. Here is Sarah who's lighting candles, who on Friday, on that very day, is bringing back life into the world. By the way, a candle is also a metaphor for knowledge, but a different type of knowledge which is from the Torah. Kiner mitzvah v'Torah or. And then the last thing which happened in the aftermath of the garden is that God's presence departs. Adam and Eve are driven out of the garden, but beyond that, no longer have any communication with God. Sarah and Avraham bring back that communication with God. And if you recall from what we spoke about last week, even though we don't find God directly talking to Sarah, but according to the Midrash, she was a greater prophetess than Avraham. And that's reflected by God affirming her statement to Avraham that he needs to get rid of Yishmael. So what am I trying to show you? The three things which this Midrash is saying, in effect, is articulating how, as I said a moment ago, Sarah is the corrective to the tragedy that happened in the story of Adam and Eve. Yitzchak brings Rivka into the tent. And the question is, will she be the one who will perpetuate that legacy? And I can't tell you how, but somehow he senses, yes, she will perpetuate that legacy. And on that basis, he marries her. So again, I want you to see that Yitzhak is an active participant in determining who he will get married to and on what basis he will marry her. He's marrying her because he sees her as the continuity of this project which Avraham and Sarah began. I would also add, it's very interesting in that story that Yitzchak loves her after he marries her, right? And we're not going to discuss this in detail now, but it's interesting that with Jacob, it's the exact opposite, right? When Jacob first sees Rachel, it's like he's blown away, head over heels. what in Hollywood would be romantic love, right? It's, straight out of a film. And with Isaac, it's more like, Fiddler on the Roof. Do you love me? Well, I do all these things for you. I guess I love you. It's a different type of love. I might even say it's a much more mature love, and it may be a love which actually grows with time as opposed to dissipates with time. And Yitzhak is comforted after his mother. I want to make a suggestion right now, and as we go along, perhaps you will see this. My suggestion is that Yitzchak's personality in many ways is shaped and even is perhaps a reflection of Sarah's personality. And to a great extent, she had much more of a role to play in who he was. And in many ways, he is the perpetuation of his mother. And having said that, I would say that it's interesting that on a certain level, Rebecca is much more similar to his father. And the clearest similarity is the story of how you treat a guest. If you look at the story in chapter 18 of how Avraham invites his guests, so Avraham is constantly running and doing and everything else. When you look at how Rebecca gives water to Avraham's servant and to his camels, all the expressions there parallel the Avraham hospitality scene. So that it becomes really very interesting that on a certain level, there may be a role reversal in the second generation. That Sarah is somehow continued through Yitzchak, and in a way, Rivka is perhaps the one who in certain ways is handing down Avraham. And because of what I spoke about last week, so I'm going to every once in a while maybe show certain ways in which Yitzhak actually perhaps is similar to his mother. So this is what we saw in the previous Parshiot. So now let's get to our Parsha. And our Parsha is on the second page, the beginning of the Parsha, the opening verses, which says the following, chapter 25, 19. I mean, this is not my translation, so I apologize. But in the Hebrew, it says, Eile Toldot Yitzchak, which literally means, these are the generations of Isaac. In the translation here, it says, this is the history of the generations of Isaac. Abraham's son, Abraham fathered Isaac. Okay, now everybody knows that this opening verse is redundant. Okay? Why are you telling me that Isaac is Abraham's son? We already know that, right, from chapter 21. And if you already told me that, then why do you say at the end of the verse, Abraham fathered Isaac? And clearly the rabbis were very sensitive to this problem. And I didn't bring it over here, but Rashi has a quote which says, why are we highlighting the fact that Avraham is the father of Yitzchak, Abraham is the father of Isaac? Because there were skeptics who said that, in fact, maybe Isaac's father is not Abraham. Maybe, in fact, his father is Avimelech. And the reason being because Avraham and Sarah lived for many years together and she did not become pregnant. But then after she was taken by Avimelech, relatively quickly afterwards, she did become pregnant. So the rabbinic comment is, what does it mean that Isaac is the son of Abraham? He looked like Abraham. So that it was clear beyond a shadow of a doubt who his father was. And all of this is to deflect all of the cynicism of all the skeptics. But I think that the pshat of the pasuk is very, very different. The pshat of the pasuk is, and here I think the history, I would, instead of saying Toldot is the history of the generations, I would translate this as these are the life events, the things that happened in Isaac's life. Isaac, the son of Abraham. And what is the Torah telling me? If you look at the life of Isaac, you will see the life of Abraham. You will see how there are many repetitions of things that happen that parallel what happened to his father. And by saying it, Abraham fathered Isaac, it's a way of really emphasizing that on a certain level, Isaac's story is very much, as I said, a parallel, a reflection of the life of Avraham. But what I'd like to do today is to in fact show you that with all the similarities between the two lives, there are very, very significant differences. And the differences highlight what made Isaac and Abraham, each one unique in their way. And that's what I'd like to do for the rest of the time that we have now. So let's actually begin with chapter 25, verse 21. Or actually, I should say, well, let's begin with verse 20. Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, to be his wife. And then in verse 21, it says, Isaac entreated Hashem for his wife because she was barren. Hashem was entreated by him, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. So, the first parallel between the life of Abraham and the life of Isaac is that coincidentally, or maybe not so coincidentally, both of them married women who were barren. Remember what I said to you last week. The first thing that we learn about Avraham, and this is at the end of chapter 11 in Bereshit, is that Avraham marries Sarai, and the Torah emphasizes she is barren. She is unable to have a child. And now we see once again, deja vu. Isaac marries Rebekah and she is barren. And not only that, but I didn't bring the subsequent verse. He married her at the age of 40. She only gives birth when Isaac is 60, which means that they were married 20 years before she finally had a child. So here I have the similarity, but how are they different? And the difference is very significant. It says Isaac entreated Hashem. The word in Hebrew is vayetar. And it's interesting that Rashi makes the comment, entreated, he prayed much and urgently. Okay, so for those of you who are familiar with Hebrew, there are a number of words for prayer in Hebrew. The general term for prayer is tefillah, lehitpalel. In the Torah, we have other words like tze'akah, crying out. But this word is actually something unique. You don't find it anywhere else in the Torah. And what is vayetar? So Rashi says it's not just praying. It's praying much, urgently. It's a very intense form of prayer. If anybody here knows modern Hebrew, the word atirah in modern Hebrew means a petition. And very often it's used when you petition the high court, let's say. Atirah lebagatz. So what I would like to suggest right now is Isaac prays. He's the only one of the patriarchs that we actually find who prays for his barren wives. But what's even more significant is not only does he pray, but God responds to his prayer, which to me then becomes a very powerful statement about how Isaac has a certain power of prayer, which perhaps goes far beyond what his father or his son have. And what is the nature of this prayer? So Rashi said he prayed much. So what I would like to suggest now, and I'm going to be pushing this point in another context in a slightly different way, is that what characterizes Isaac is that he's very, very persistent. He's very persistent. When he has a certain goal, he focuses on that goal, and he doesn't let up until he accomplishes his goal. In this context, what it means is, for 20 years, Isaac prays day in, day out. And he continues to pray. And he prays in a way which is very focused and which is very intense. He pleads with God. And ultimately, he succeeds. God is responsive to his prayer. This is something which Isaac has, which perhaps Abraham didn't have. The ability to pray. And what is he praying about? Isaac is praying for a child. I would imagine Abraham also prayed for a child. I would imagine Jacob prayed for children. And yet the Torah doesn't tell us, and I think it doesn't tell us not because they didn't pray, but because in the end, God was not responsive to their prayers. So I want to show you how, here is one example of how Isaac is very proactive in a very persistent manner. Now I would like to say something else. If I go back to the story of when the servant brings back Rebekah and she sees Isaac, where does she see Isaac? Well, Isaac was in the field. And it says that Isaac was going into the field, lasuach basadeh. The word lasuach in Hebrew can be translated as to converse, like sicha, conversation. Very often translations say to contemplate in the field. If you go back to that verse at the end of chapter 24, on the basis of that verse, the rabbis say Isaac instituted tfilat mincha. He went out to pray towards evening. What is Isaac praying about or praying for? So right now, I would like to suggest that Isaac was actually praying for the success of the mission of the servant of Abraham. And for those of you who remember, Abraham's servant also prayed to God that God should help him find the right woman. And when Isaac is out in the field praying, lo and behold, here she is, she shows up. So I want to begin by saying the first thing we see about Isaac is a certain power, capacity of prayer, okay, which maybe he had, that his father and son did not. And I also want to say that Isaac, what is he praying for? Because I see somebody made, a comment about stone. Abraham also prayed. Abraham prayed to God that stone should not be destroyed. He's praying for something which has what we would call cosmic implications. Isaac is praying for what we could call the most fundamental things of day-to-day existence. for his continuity. It's not about something which is earth-shattering. If you recall, I spoke last week about Sarai and related it to my wife. That what characterized Sarai was just her love of life and her ability to experience every moment, and that there wasn't necessarily anything earth-shattering in what she was doing. It was just embracing all that life had to offer. And maybe this is a similar thing that we find by Isaac. Isaac is very much involved in what we would call the day-to-day drudgeries of life. And yet somehow Isaac, right, has this capacity to pray for those things and to get a response. But I will develop this idea a little bit more as we go along. So now let's come to the next part. Reference number 4, chapter 26, verse 1. And this is what we're going to really focus on today. There was a famine in the land, besides the first famine that was in the days of Avraham. So once again, the Torah itself is drawing an analogy between Abraham's life, Isaac's life. In chapter 12 in Bereshit, after Avraham comes into the land of Israel, there's a famine in the land. Now, once again, there's a famine in the land. And by the way, I would make the argument, it didn't just happen. It may very well be that in both cases, God orchestrated the famine. Just as we find later on, there's a famine in the time of Jacob and Joseph, which clearly is brought about by God. And here is Isaac, following in the footsteps of his father, who's essentially on his way to the land of Egypt. But as part of that journey, he stops off in the land of the Philistines. And anybody who knows the geography of the land of Israel knows that the shortest distance of going from Israel into Egypt is via the Gaza Strip, which is the land of Plishtim. And then all of a sudden, God appeared to him and said, do not go down into Egypt. Live in the land that I will tell you. Now, interestingly, that didn't happen with Abraham. God let Abraham go down to Egypt. But here God is explicitly coming and saying to Isaac, don't go. Why? So I didn't bring this over here. For those of you who are interested, you can look at this. If you look at Rashi's commentary, you'll see that Rashi says, because since Isaac was a burnt offering, a sacrifice, he has holiness, and that holiness does not allow him to leave the land of Israel. What I would like to suggest, which is not contradictory, but complementary to Rashi, is that Isaac's holiness was not just created when he became the burnt offering at the Akedah, but Isaac's holiness was from the moment of his inception. And what makes Isaac unique is that Isaac is the only one of the patriarchs who was born, bred, and dies in the land of Israel. Isaac never left the land of Israel. And what I will now suggest is that Isaac is, in a certain sense, the personification, the symbol of the land of Israel, of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. And by the way, this is not my unique idea. This is an idea that you find in rabbinic literature. And in a few moments, we'll see why the rabbis suggest that. But at the very least, the very fact that Isaac lives his whole life in the land of Israel, never leaves it, becomes a very, very important symbol. Now, once again, I want to go back to Sarah. Last week we spoke about how when Sarah dies, her death and the purchase of the cave of Machpelah become a symbol for the Jewish people, for the connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. But that connection to the land of Israel is manifested in her son, whose whole life is in the land of Israel. So once again, what I'm trying to show you is that evidently there is a certain connection which Sarah had to the land, which is then handed down to her son. Now, I'm going to skip a few things over here, but because Yitzchak stays in the land of Philistines, we then have another story which parallels what happened with Abraham. And that is passing off his wife as a sister. Abraham did it twice. Isaac now does it. Except that whereas by Abraham, when he passed off Sarai as his sister, she was taken by two kings. In the case of Isaac, that doesn't happen. Now, I personally think it didn't happen also because the king in this story, Avimelech, which is a different Avimelech, the same title but a different king, was actually a very righteous individual. But once again, what I think is interesting here is perhaps there's also a certain divine, how should I put it, protection, which God has of Isaac, where God intervenes and tells Isaac, don't leave the land of Israel. I'll take care of you over here. Stay in the land of the Philistines. And then subsequently, where God somehow brings about that Rebekah will not be taken. Now, why am I saying all this? Because on a certain level, it seems that maybe Isaac has a certain, what I would call magical type of existence, where somehow God is especially looking over him. Now, what I would like to do is, as I said, skip a few verses and get to what I see as the bulk of the shiur. And that's verse 12. Isaac sowed, planted in the land, and reaped in that same year 100 times what he planted. And God blessed him. And the man grew great and grew more and more until he became very great. He had possessions of flocks, possessions of herds, a great household, and the Philistines envied him. So, remember we said that there's a parallel. Avraham lives during a period of famine, Isaac lives. But now look at the difference, significant difference. Isaac plants during a time of famine. We don't find that Avraham planted. Avraham went down to the land of Egypt to be able to get food. And notice the fact, which is very interesting, Avraham's wealth is the result of having sheep and cattle. Jacob's wealth in next week's parsha is a result of having sheep and cattle. Isaac's wealth is a result of planting. Isaac plants in that place, in that year, that place. What's that place? The land of the Philistines. For those of you, I said the Gaza Strip. It's an arid area. It gets relatively little rainfall. In that year was a year which was especially lacking in rainfall. There was a famine, and he produces 100-fold. By the way, the word in Hebrew is Meir Sha'arim. For those of you who don't know, the word sha'ar can mean gate, but it could also mean like a rate, 100 measures. And the Torah tells me Why did this happen? Vayevarcheu Hashem, because God blessed him. So, because my time is running out, and unfortunately I have a tendency to do this, I now want to kind of get a little bit to the punchline over here and say something that Isaac was actually the forerunner of Ben-Gurion. Because Isaac is the first one to plant in the land of Israel. Everybody thinks, oh, Ben-Gurion, right? The Zionists, the socialists, right? They were the ones who created the kibbutzim. This whole idea, I.D. Gordon, we have to go back to the land, okay? But where does it come from? It comes from the Torah, it comes from Isaac. But perhaps I say, in contrast to the socialists, working the land was not just a value because of, physical manual labor. Working the land for Isaac is a way of bringing back the divine presence in the land. And now I want to say something which relates to how I began the shiur. I began by referring to Sarai and Avraham as being the reversal, the corrective of the curse of Adam and Eve. And I also said that in many ways, Isaac is the continuation of his mother. What Isaac is doing now is taking that corrective to a whole other level. And what do I mean by that? If with Adam and Eve, God said to Adam, the land is now cursed. The land will produce thorns and thistles. By the sweat of your brow, you will eat bread. And then we see subsequently, there is a continuing process of the land being cursed. God says it to Cain. He says the land will not bring forth its bounty. Subsequently, God destroys the land in the flood story. And then later on, God destroys the land in Sodom. There seems to be this ongoing story of how the land is cursed because of the sins of people. Isaac now is reversing that process. Isaac is bringing the land back to a state of blessing. Rather than the land producing thorns and thistles, rather than it not giving its full bounty, the land produces 100-fold. But it's not only that Isaac is restoring the harmony between people and land. The land now becomes the venue, the medium for having God's presence brought back into the world. God is manifest by the tremendous bounty that Isaac brings in. To put it in different language, and this is why I said Isaac is the forerunner of Ben-Gurion. Isaac is the one who makes the desert bloom. Isaac is the one who transforms a desert into a Garden of Eden. And that's why I mentioned earlier, it's not just that Isaac was born, bred, and lives his whole life in the land of Israel. But Isaac becomes, in a way, the manifestation of the relationship between the Jewish people and the land, and why the land is so significant to the Jewish people. Because we have the opportunity to take a desert and make it bloom. And by making it bloom, we manifest through that the presence of God in the world. How does Abraham bring the consciousness of God into the world? He does it by building altars. How does Isaac do it? He also builds altars. But for Isaac, that's not what's so significant. For Isaac, what's significant is bringing the presence of God through the land. And then that is taken one step further. In the story that follows, Isaac becomes extremely wealthy, and the reaction of the Philistines is that they're jealous. They're jealous to the point where the king comes and says to Isaac, leave. But what interests me more is verse 15. When the Philistines become jealous, it says, all the wells which his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham, the Philistines stopped up, filled with earth. Abraham digs wells, and you can read about that in chapter 21. But Isaac digs wells, as we'll see in a moment. Digging wells for Isaac becomes a major project. Now think about this. If you're living in a semi-arid area, which needs water, digging wells is what can now take a place that's dead and bring it to life. Water is the essential element to create life. And this is what Isaac engaged in, digging wells. Think about this also from the perspective of the Philistines. They're jealous of Isaac. And how do they express their jealousy? Stuffing up the wells his father had dug, trying to somehow obliterate his memory. But in stuffing up those wells, it's what we call cutting off your nose to spite your face. Because ultimately, they're not just hurting Isaac, they're hurting themselves. And now what fascinates me is after Avimelech the king, this is verse 16, says to Isaac, leave us, get away from here. You're too powerful. Which, by the way, has a parallel later to Pharaoh, but there are differences. I'm not going to go into that now. It's interesting what's Isaac's response. 17. Isaac departed from there, encamped in the valley of Gerar, and lived there. And it's fascinating that there could have been three possible responses, and look at what Isaac chose. One response would have been to say to Avimelech, I'm not going to budge. You're telling me I'm powerful? Yes, I'm powerful. And you want me to move? I'm going to fight you, and you're going to have to fight to the end. A second possibility is that Isaac will just pick up and run. And what Isaac chooses is the third possibility, what I call tactical retreat. On the one hand, he's not going to run away, because to run away means to somehow deny his father's legacy. To run away means to somehow validate behavior which is totally unacceptable. Stuffing up wells that in the end just brings death and damage, that's unacceptable behavior by any standard. Confrontation is also not Isaac's thing. He's not looking for a fight. And instead, what does he do? Tactical retreat. He moves away, but he then sticks to his principles. And now look at verse 18. Isaac dug again the wells of water which they had dug in the days of Abraham his father, for the Philistines had stopped them up after the death of Abraham. He called their names after the names by which his father. He redigs the wells. He renames the wells. The first thing that he does is to say, I will not allow what my father worked for to be destroyed. I will do everything to maintain his legacy. But then look at verse 19. Isaac's servants dug in the valley and found there a well of spring, but then he starts digging his own wells. And then in verse 20, All of a sudden, we see the herdsmen of Gerar argued, saying the water is ours. And they called the place Esek because they contended with him, which means that Isaac digs his own wells. Why? Because he sees digging wells as a value. And the value is to bring life into the world, life which everybody can benefit from. And what does that lead to? It leads to a contention. Look at verse 21. They dug another well. And once again, they argue over that and call it sitna. So rather than Isaac being dissuaded after he digs the first well, he digs the second well. And the second well leads to further contention. Sitna, what's sitna? From Satan. Enmity, adversity, which means that things are heating up. And verse 22, he left that place and dug another well. And they did not argue over that one. And he called it Rechovot, because Hashem has made room for us and we will be fruitful in the land. What do I want to show you over here? What characterizes Isaac, I said earlier in the shir, is his persistence in prayer. But that same persistence is reflected here in this story in digging wells. Isaac believes that digging wells is a value which ultimately is for the good of everyone. Digging wells is a blessing, and he will not be deterred from doing that. And initially, it leads to contention. But ultimately, Isaac's persistence, and I would say a persistence which is done in a non-confrontational way, ultimately brings about a reality of acceptance, and even more than acceptance, of peace. And I realize my time is over, and I apologize for the people who are pressured to go. So let me just say, if you look subsequently, Isaac in verse 25, he builds there an altar, calls the name of Hashem, and his servants dig another well. And then in 26, Avimelech went to him from Gerar. And Isaac says to this delegation which comes to him, why do you come to me since you hate me? You've sent me away. By the way, this is fascinating. He tells it like it is. He's very upfront with, he feels that these people did an injustice to him. And what's the response? They said, we saw plainly that Hashem is with you. We said, let there now be an oath between us and you, and make a covenant with you, that you will do us no harm as we have not touched you. And we have done to you nothing but good and have sent you away in peace. You are now the blessed of Hashem. And now I want to just see two more verses. He made them a feast. They ate and drank. They rose up sometime in the morning, swore to one another. Isaac sent them away, and they departed from him in peace. And it happened the same day that Isaac's servants came and told him concerning the well which they had dug, and said to him, we have found water. This last story has its parallel by Abraham. In chapter 21, the previous Avimelech comes to Abraham and says, I want to make a pact with you. This time, the new Avimelech comes to Isaac and says, I want to make a pact with you. In the previous pact, there is a dispute about wells. Here, there is a dispute about wells. In the previous pact, the way that the dispute is solved is by Abraham giving sheep to Avimelech to acknowledge his ownership of the wells. In this pact, Isaac makes a feast. They eat, they drink. There are two pacts. Abraham's pact is what today we would call a non-aggression agreement. Isaac's pact is what today we would call normalization. Isaac achieves something which Abraham never achieved. He is able to actually live in peace with the people around him. He's able to eat and drink. He's able, the day after, to dig new wells without there being any fights. What Abraham, the treaty which Abraham made, was abrogated in the story that we just read with Isaac. So what I would like to end with is to say, Isaac is someone, as I mentioned last week about Sarai, who's not a maker and shaker, what we call a heavyweight. He's somebody who is persistent, who has principles, sticks to those principles in his very low-key way. But by his persistence, he's able to accomplish things which even Abraham was unable to accomplish. And that is his greatness. His greatness is in being able, as I said, to bring life into the world, to dig wells, to make the desert bloom, to achieve a harmony, not only with nature, but with the people around him. And ultimately, through all that, to bring the presence of God in the same way that Sarah's tent had the cloud that symbolized the presence of God. She made her home environment a sanctuary. What Isaac did was to make the land of Israel the place of having an I-thou encounter. This was Isaac's greatness. And I hope that I perhaps gave you a different perspective on Isaac. And I know, although I didn't have a chance to look at the chats, but inevitably, there are people who are going to say to me, yeah, but if you look at the next chapter, right, and the whole story about the blessings, right, so Isaac seems to be taken advantage of, to be fooled, and he gave the blessing, quote unquote, to the wrong person. Stay tuned next year. And I promise next year I'll talk about chapter 27 and show you how even in chapter 27, Isaac was not this victim of circumstance, but Isaac knew fully well who he was giving to the blessing to, and had a very clear reason for why he gave him that blessing. Shabbat shalom, everybody.